Bom, vamos começar então, só para não extrapolar o prazo, Fernando, se você puder compartilhar a tua apresentação, são 20 minutos de apresentação e daí depois mais 10 minutos de discussão, tá? Para cada apresentador.
Ok. Deixa eu colocar aqui então. Vocês estão vendo a apresentação? Tudo ok?
Beleza.
Então, seguindo até o que o Darcy falou, acho que eu vou apresentar em inglês, já está em inglês os slides, mas aí qualquer coisa a gente pergunta em português, então se à vontade a gente vai trocando. Pode começar então? I'm going to present the paper titled Practice Transfer and Social Value Creation, Existing Dilemmas in Cross-Sector Collaborations. This work is co-authored with Sérgio Lazzarini, Ricardo Paes de Barros, and with Tranquilla. Basically here, we aim at investigating practice transfer dilemmas in the context of cross-sector collaborations, more specifically in education. And the theory we build upon refer to the performance-enhancing managerial practices in this context. So we have three different venues here. First, scholars acknowledge that managerial practices, they are successful. So basically they work, they enhance performance once properly implemented. Second, these practices, they are known as replicable and easily imitable. So different than resources, the practice-based view acknowledge that this could be easily accessible by different firms. And third, a different venue focuses on the pivotal role of public managers linking their organizational internal networks with external sources of information. So this would be the so-called boundary spanners, individuals who are at the boundary of their organizations and who should translate the knowledge they receive to their fellow colleagues and workers. Our main hypothesis within this framework is that cross-sector collaborations might work as a double-edged sword. Why? Because although replication of practice would be highly beneficial from a public standpoint, because basically that's what you want governments to do, to learn and to replicate practice, to reach as far as they can and improve people's lives, basically. On the other way around, it may undermine the effort of external transferring side partners, and eventually it would lead to an underestimation of its perceived contribution. So basically, we have replication efforts that are socially desirable, but whenever this replication goes beyond contracts, it should distort performance assessments. Within here, like in our paper, we are going to explore a cross-sector collaboration in education, and we collaborated with Instituto Unibanco, who partnered with state departments of education, basically, just to give you a hint of what I'm talking about. So in further details, we have a transferring side partner. In our case, it is Instituto Unibanco, the external organization to the government. They are transferring practice to a public organization, state departments of education, as I just said. And they are transferring knowledge both to boundary spanners. In this case, they are heads of school districts, and they should focus on target subunits. In this empirical setting, these are schools that were determined to receive this managerial practice they are transferring. And in some, they want to improve their performance, basically. Yet, so this is the baseline hypothesis. Like we are not being innovative here. This is just according to prior literature. So the transfer of management practice from an external partner to a public learning side partner increases the performance of the target subunit. So basically, as I mentioned before, managerial practice should work. So moving on, we will argue that these boundary spanners, they may internalize practice and further replicate them to units that were not selected to receive this practice upfront. So in our context, Instituto Unibanco determined targeted and non-targeted subunits according to NRCT. So schools were randomized to receive the treatment or not. And basically, whenever boundary spanners, the school district managers internalize practice and further replicate them, they would increase the performance of non-targeted schools, and these would represent a control contamination to the RCT design, right? Basically, the performance of non-targeted schools would be higher, and this would represent a bias for any sort of experimental design, but in this case, this is an RCT to assess the performance of the targeted subunits. And then formally, we have our hypothesis. Hypothesis 2A, the higher degree of internalization of practice by the boundary spanners, in our case, school district managers, the higher the performance of the non-targeted units, in our case, schools at the control group. And hypothesis 2B, as a consequence, we argue that this would reduce the assessed contribution of the external transferring side partner. And lastly, our third hypothesis, we are going to investigate nuances of these non-targeted subunits. So we argue that as this transfer here is via replication of practice, we have no external enforcement to assure that these units are properly implementing this practice. Because here, if we are investigating the primary transfer of practice, in our case, Instituto Unibanco is monitoring these in order to check if units are properly implementing practice. But whenever we are talking about replication of practice, there is no external enforcement here, right? So we argue that these units, in order to properly receive and in order to be able to implement this practice, they need to have resources, basically. So formally, we argue that the performance effect of internalization of practice and further replication, this here, right, via boundary spanners, is enhanced by the presence of superior human capital resources, hypothesis 3A, and human capital resources in terms of schools. We are talking about like school principals, if they have college degree, if teachers have college degrees, the number of teachers per student, stuff like that. And hypothesis 3B, we refer to physical resources. So in terms of schools here, if they have access to libraries, the numbers of computers they have per students, and other things like that. So this is our conceptual framework, basically. And then, as I mentioned before, we have cross-sector in education, right? The transfer side partner is Instituto Unibanco, a private non-profit organization. They are specialized in managerial practice, in some target setting and performance monitoring. This is more complicated than that, but basically that's it. And they are transferring this managerial practice to a public organization. More specifically, 2 state departments of education for this research, Piauí and Espírito Santo. Summing up, they have 20 school districts headed each by 1 upper level manager, the school district manager, the boundary spanner, according to the literature. And these 20 managers, they are leading 233 targets, so the treatment group, and 161 non-targeted, so the control group schools. Each manager has under his or her jurisdiction both treatment and control schools. And then our hypothesized relationship here is that our main independent variable is the practice internalization, right? We measure it according to a survey that Instituto Unibanco employed with these managers. And we We reduce the survey information to a factor using different methodologies as principal factor or other as maximum likelihood for robustness. And then our dependent variable here refer to educational outcomes per school, right? So this is a national standardized test. We consider both math and languages, so Portuguese, the students' aggregated scores per school. And as control variables, we consider the distance between schools, both the nearest control school and the nearest treated school per each, teachers and computers per student, teacher with college degree, the percentage per school, student gender, ethnicity, and their age. This is all aggregated per school. So at first, to investigate the primary transfer of practice, we should consider the RCT, right? So a sort of naive investigation here would be merely observing if the targeted school is going better than the control school. And to do that, we would rely on the RCT and employ a difference in difference method to investigate the performance enhancing effect of practice. This is our main, our baseline hypothesis. Just according to prior literature, managerial practice should enhance performance. Yet, if we want to investigate the replication of practice, we should go beyond and not simply rely on the RCT, because as I mentioned before, we would have control contamination issues. So what we did to try to capture this replication of practice was basically considering a triple difference method. So we have the performance here, right? Either math or languages. The targeted school is the one selected as the treatment group. This is a binary variable. Then we have the practice internalization, which is the index developed by Unibanco to investigate whether managers were able to internalize practice and further replicate them. Post-treatment, and then the interactions according to the triple difference. What we want to investigate more specifically is this one here. So post-treatment, interacting with the targeted schools, and the index for internalization. The hypothesis here is that we expect a negative sign for this coefficient, right? Because once the manager internalize more practice, then the difference between targeted and control schools in our setting should be diminished, right? Because managers who internalize more practice, they will replicate them, and then this would represent an increase in the performance of the control group, what would diminish the assessed performance of the targeted. So the difference between targeted and non-targeted would be diminished if they are in districts where managers internalize the most. And then we have the controls as I described before. And lastly, to investigate the moderation effect, we considered only the subsample of non-targeted schools, so the control group, and we analyze interactions between human capital, and here this is I consider different variables as the number of teachers per student and their physical capacity. I considered as my main specification the number of computers per student, but we have different, different measures as well. So moving on to our analysis and results, right? This is the conceptual framework as I presented up front. We have our analysis, they consist on OLS regressions. They are all clustered at the boundary spanner level. And so regarding our main hypothesis, regarding our baseline hypothesis, indeed, managerial practice, they increase performance. We found strong results here, both for math and languages. And I recall you that it's easier to perceive effects on math than languages. Prior literature shows that for several reasons, like psychological, early childhood development, it's easier to perceive effects on math than languages, but we found strong effects for both. And this effect corresponds to 1 year of additional schooling. And here we're talking about high school students. So they receive the program during high school, so 3 years. And after, if they are in treated schools, they are better as if they were 1 extra year in school. So this is an amazing achievement. And then we go to our main hypothesis regarding the practice replication. And we also found support. If we use a continuous measure, we found support for math, and this would represent a reduced assessed performance of Unibanco in around 36% for 1 additional standard deviation of internalization of practice. And if we consider, instead of a continuous measure, a 3-level measure, low, medium, and high internalization, we also found support for languages, but just for the highest level. What makes sense? According to prior literature, it's harder to perceive effects on languages, so it would require the highest levels of internalization. And lastly, regarding our moderator resources hypothesis, we found no support. So it seems that non-targeted schools, the control group, they are able to implement practice they receive via replication, even if they lack resources, both in terms of human capital or physical resources. But I remind you that although we do not support this hypothesis, it even emphasizes the importance of replication, in the sense that if managers are able to internalize and further replicate practice, these practices are enough to increase performance, even if non-targeted subunits lack resources. So it even emphasizes the importance of practice. This goes aligned with the practice-based view, basically. So as our conclusions, we contribute to the strategic management literature. There are scholars investigating the challenges of public-private contracting. We show that the boundary spanners, individuals who should internalize and transfer knowledge to their peers, they work as a double-edged sword in cross-sector collaborations, right? Because we have dilemmas related to intellectual rights and performance measurement. There are performance implications of practice transfer at the cross-sector boundary. Once these practices are relatively replicable and transferable across units, we show that they corroborating with prior literature, and this replication would not require resourceful units in order to be successful. So this is quite interesting as well. And as managerial implications, we argue that whenever practice replication goes beyond the scope of collaboration, and here in our example, it is like we have an RCT and practice replication are achieving control units, right? It would reduce the perceived importance of the transferring side partner. And this has a lot of pervasive consequences. Like, so if we're talking about long-term relationships and long-term interactions, for instance, if we consider consulting firms, they are basically transferring knowledge. And if they would like to assess the impact that their activities have, this would undermine their efforts. So perhaps reducing their perceived importance. The learning side partner might not value the transferring side efforts as they should. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much for your feedback. I've seen that some people are writing on the chat. Now I may take a look, and please, I'm more than glad to answer your questions and clarify anything.
Thank you, Fernando. So now we have 10 minutes of discussion here. And I have one curiosity already here. about the practice internalization index. Could you talk a bit more about it? Do they conduct some research in the schools or?
Yes, for sure. So these basically they interviewed these managers. People from Unibanco, the researchers from INSPER and HEC were not involved in these interviews, but Unibanco staff interviewed both the managers and school staff. And basically they wanted to assess if the boundary spanners, the upper level managers, were able to understand what these best managerial practice were and how they should implement them. So basically, if they understood what data-driven routines were, if they understood what is a good monitoring, if they understood how to organize target setting for different schools, and if they interacted with supervisors from the State Department of Education, and how often they considered feedback from schools and stuff like that. And then they developed, they have the questionnaire, and I reduce all this information according to a common factor. The Cronbach alpha is quite reliable, like 0.7, something like that.
And do you have any idea how long did it take for the entire process, like from interviews to analyzing the results?
For Unibanco, it took quite long, and actually they are still investigating these upper level managers, because I have data on Espírito Santo and Piauí, but they are still doing a lot of work in other states as well, not only Piauí and Espírito Santo. I'm aware that Unibanco is even they want to develop different RCTs to have both qualitative and quantitative evidence regarding these replication efforts. But this is next research. So I think that in the chat, do I have time, Gustavo?
Yes, we have 7 minutes left.
So, okay, what kind of managerial practice? I answered, and then why not Ceará, Piauí, and Espírito Santo? I'm answering Professor Paulo Arvat's questions here, right? So this is the data that I have at that time. This is the third generation of the Jovem de Futuro. Afterwards, I shouldn't rely on the second generation, because only in the third generation of the program, they started to transfer practice to the upper level managers as well. For the first and second, they were transferring practice directly to the schools. And then I wouldn't have a setting to investigate replication via the upper level managers. And I know that I might have access to Rio Grande do Norte data, but I'm not sure if my results will hold, because what happened there is a little different. The boundary spanners who replicated praxis were not the school district managers, but the State Department staff themselves. So the pessoal da secretaria replicou práticas, eles não repassaram pelos gestores, assim, basicamente. But I have to check it out. And yes, yeah, event study. I need to develop exactly. This is the next steps that I want to go. But even though like I don't have much, like the baseline year is 2014, and then the program was implemented during 15 to 2017, just 3 years. I don't have data before and after, but I might check with the data that I have.
Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, we can just go with Darcy's presentation. No? So I think that we could go to your presentation, Darcy. We still have a few more minutes to do. So congratulations, Fernando. Thank you for the presentation.
I think Paulo, José, and Professor Paulo Arvati would like to ask some question to Fernando. I don't know.
Yeah, if it is from the chat, he already asked it. I'm not sure.
Yes, he answered.
Yeah,
thank you.
Fernando replied to them.
Okay, I'm gonna share my presentation here. Okay, is everybody? Could everybody see my presentation here?
No,
Not yet.
Agora sim.
Okay.
Okay.
Something wrong here. Wait a minute. Okay. Could everybody see my presentation? Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna give you a brief presentation of my paper in the next 20-25 minutes. It is it's only the second time that I have the opportunity to present my ideas in public, so comments are very, very welcome. This paper is about waste of public resources in the context of judicial review of public policies. Judicial review of public policies is a very common phenomenon worldwide. In some areas, such as healthcare and social security, judicial reviews can completely modify policies. And additionally, the enforcement of those judicial reviews is costly depending on how the court orders are enforced. Here I use a specific setting to estimate, to access those costs, and it consists of health litigation and public procurement here in Brazil. My expected contribution is that usually waste is associated with mismanagement and corruption, basically internal aspects of public administration. However, external shocks, regardless those aspects, internal aspects, could bring distortions and waste as well. So the idea here is to contribute by providing evidence that external shocks could explain waste as well. This is metoprolol succinate 25 milligrams. It is a prescription drug used to treat mainly heart diseases. It is a drug available in the Brazilian health system list to be used in its public programs. People can receive it for free. Here we have two purchases of metoprolol succinate 25 milligrams. One in April 2014 and another in July 2014. The first purchase was performed at Bauru Regional Unit is a public buyer unit here in São Paulo State. The auctioneer in charge was Sérgio Assunção Orlandi. He was performing an e-platform that we call here at São Paulo, BEC São Paulo, Bolsa Eletrônica de Compras. It was a multi-round insane auction, is a pregão, and the quantities was 320 packages of this drug. And the final price, the negotiated unit price was 133 reais. The second one in July 2014 was performed by the same regional unit, the same auctioneer, the same e-platform, back the same type of purchase, pregão, and similar quantities, and the final price was 51 cents, 160% more expensive. The first purchase was 106% more expensive, and the question here is why? Because of the first purchase was generated by a judicial request to buy this drug. Even though some prescription drugs are available in health public programs, individuals request them through court orders, and I'm gonna comment this later. The point here is that judicial requests undermine the public procurement process, leading to inefficiency, to higher prices, for instance. Basically, in this case, it demands a shorter time to prepare the purchase and a shorter time to deliver the drug. So my research question here is, what is the impact of health litigation on the efficiency of public procurement? My context here is that judiciary acting as a policymaker is a very common issue, and health procurement is a good example of it. My point here is that public health procurement is shaped not only by administrative choices, but also by judicial decisions that enforce the law on public buyer units, and it affects the purchases as well. Judicial enforcement is costly for two reasons. First, mandatory purchases are always urgent, then they undermine procurement planning process. And two, since judicial sanctions for non-compliance are severe, auctioneers have higher incentives to accept higher prices in order to comply with the court orders. In Brazil, healthcare litigation is very common. It involves prescription drugs, non-prescription drugs, medical procedures, and others. And the source of all confusion in this context lies in this constitutional article that I mentioned here. In Brazilian Federal Constitution, health is a right of all and a duty of the state. And the problem here is that judges in Brazil tend to interpret the constitutional text, this article, literally, without considering the costs of their decisions. Since there is a low cost to access the judiciary in Brazil, then individuals often sue the Brazilian state, and their main claim is that they have the right to receive the treatment they need or to be funded by the public health system in any case. And in Brazil, we have high rates of success in this type of judicial request. Nearly 85% of first instance claims prosper, and the rates in superior courts are even higher. And this affects a lot the public budget. For instance, in 2018, public spending for litigate health items represented nearly 5% of the annual budget of the Department of Public Health. And from 2008 to 2017, the cases increased in 9 times here in São Paulo. The lawsuits occur in many municipalities with wide dispersion in the state of São Paulo. Court orders consist of a huge variety of different items across time. For instance, between 2009 and 2018, nearly 3,000 different items were ordered at least once a year on average. The Department of Health is responsible for managing public resources and implementing public health policies in the state of São Paulo. It consists of 99 decentralized public buy units that we call here PBUs, distributed around the state. So every year, each PBU receives funds directly from the headquarters, and they can manage their budgets with a high degree of autonomy, including making purchases. The purchases are all decentralized here in Brazil. Since 2009, the Department of Health tries to try to mitigate this issue, and the solution was that they call the administrative request. Basically, is an attempt to negotiate directly with an individual before a court order occurs. The idea is to avoid the judiciary. However, there is no difference between a court order and an administrative request if we think about planning purchase. When some administrative request prosper or a judicial request prosper, they have the same effect on purchase. It's always shorter delivery time and shorter time to plan the purchases and execute them. So the main mechanism here that I'm investigating is that preliminary injunctions or administrative requests force PBUs to make urgent acquisitions. Then PBUs have less time to plan and execute them, and this leads to inefficiency. My data is from this platform called Back São Paulo, and from public notices. For each purchase offer, I can observe negotiated items. There is a very detailed catalog of items with a very detailed description of those items. I can observe all auction bids, the tender type, if pregão, convite, dispensa de licitação, all participant sellers. I can observe reference price. This is a confidential information, but I could have access to the reference price of each bid, the winner bid, the auctioneer in charge, the organizer PBU, and among other variables. My data is from 2009 to 2019. And I have access to another data set from Department of Health that they call S-Codes database. That basically is a very detailed description of all judicial requests here in the state of São Paulo. And I have access to all the texts of court decisions here. So my empirical strategy is divided into 2 parts. The first part that I call overall enforcement effect, the idea is to estimate the overall effect of having a worse planning process on tenders outcomes if we compare with to ordinary purchase. So the idea of my identification strategy is based on the fact that success of judicial or administrative requests are not correlated with any unobservable factors in the purchase process. success of judicial or administrative requests depends on the claimant's characteristics and how judiciary or the public administration deals with them. So tender results do not depend on who placed the order or who will benefit from it. And this is reinforced by that we call the impersonality principle of the public administration, that makes this breaks this link between the judicial request or administrative request and the tender process, how they develop. So the tender outcomes depend on the purchase, basically on the purchase characteristics, such as the items to be purchased, the planning and market conditions. So a possible concern here, maybe we can observe low quality PBUs that could be sources of court orders, maybe the lack of bad managerial practices, bad capabilities or something like that. So, however, first of all, we can observe that only 4% of the cases, it's because of lack of stock that could indicate some lack of managerial practices or something like that. The main reasons for litigation and administrative requests are three. One is the treatment package. Most court orders require the whole treatment of a specific disease for an individual. The request is usually for a set or package of different drugs with SUS lists drugs and out of SUS list drugs. So sometimes they are people go to judiciary to get a prescription drug that is not on the SUS list, but they are asking for a treatment package, and those guys, the judges asked for the executive to buy all the drugs, since the state of São Paulo doesn't have a good logistic process. They don't have stock when the judges asks for it, so they have to buy in an urgent way. Another reason is off-label uses. Sometimes individuals go to judiciary to get a drug, a prescription drug, to be used in a disease that is not in the regulation of the SUS. So they go to judiciary to get it for free. And it's nothing to do, again, with the outcomes, the tender's outcomes. And another reason is jumping the line. The drugs are available, but sometimes individuals do not want to wait the standard time for the drug, and they go to judiciary, and again, it's nothing to do with the tender's outcomes. So the idea here, so I in order to get rid of some other possible bias, I can observe the same exact item, the same PBU, auctioneer, year, type of auction, among other variables, and I can compare ordinary and urgent purchases only with the different conditions of planning. That's the idea here. My sample is prescription and non-prescription drugs that are on the SUS list in this first case, because I can observe the government buying in an ordinary way, in an urgent way. Urgent here, it's litigated and administrative requests, both that have almost the same characteristics. I use fixed effects for items to estimate my first equation here. My variable of interest is this urgent variable that has a value of 1 if it's litigated or administrative purchase, and 0 if it's an ordinary purchase. I use some controls. I use item fixed effects and some time trend dummies. And my results here with some different specifications. And my main result, this is for negotiated prices. I can observe that in urgent tenders, I have higher negotiated prices, fewer participant firms, fewer bids, and a lower probability of success if you compare urgent tenders with ordinary tenders. The second part of my empirical strategy is that I call the under the gun effect. So the point here is that we have litigated and administrative requests. They have the same characteristics in terms of purchase conditions, but that means lack of time in the planning process, short delivery time, etc., except for the fact that in litigate purchases, there are sanctions for non-compliance. And in administrative purchase, no sanctions. Sanctions, what kind of sanctions? The PBUs or the auctioneers can get some fines, administrative, civil, and criminal liability, and blocking or hijacking public funds. The idea here is to compare litigated versus administrative purchases. I can observe the same exact item, PBUs, and so on, the same conditions of planning in this case, with only the difference in terms of conditions, potential punishment. My sample here, I use prescription, non-prescription drugs. Now I can use all the drugs that I can observe, because now, even if it's not in the SUS list, I can observe litigate and administrative requests for all medicines. I use again fixed effects. Now my variable of interest is this ADM, 1 if it's administrative and 0 if it's a litigate purchase. I use control variables and item fixed effects again. I estimate those for many specifications. And if I compare litigated and administrative purchases, the possibility of judicial sanctions increase prices in nearly 9% of because of this possibility of judicial sanctions. So a takeaway: there are significant judicial enforcement costs. There's not automatic when the judges demand a specific the enforcement specific law is not free of costs. They are significant in many times. Possible institutional arrangements can mitigate this waste. Maybe some joint actions between judicial and the judiciary and executive, or the creation of a specific type of purchase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darcy. So we have a few questions already from Professor Arvati, if you want to answer to them, the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna see it right now. You have several confounding effects to explain the difference. Did you think about like problems of supply? Maybe I need to challenge more my empirical strategy. However, for instance, problems of supply, the Department of Health gave me some data about it. It is not a common problem. The nature of these judicial requests is not directly there's nothing to do exactly with this lack of stock or breaks in of supplies. There are other reasons. The PBU issue could be a problem that I can investigate more. This kind of investigate some differences in managerial and capability. So I'm trying to get some data from auctioneers, education, tenure, and so on, to try to see heterogeneities in this kind of problem. But I need to challenge more my empirical strategy and see what kind of other confounding I can observe and I have to treat. Which tools did you use to measure or map market conditions? Well, I don't measure exactly that, but I have the times of planning and execute. So sometimes I can observe that when we have urgent purchases, the average time for planning is 3 to 5 days. And an ordinary purchase, it's always on average 30 days of planning process. And from the publication of a public notice to the execution, again, the urgent purchase is about 1-2 days, and ordinary purchase is about 3 days. So I have those measures of times to see the market conditions and the quantities. I'm controlling for quantities to see these market conditions. If you go to the market and try to buy a specific number of packages of some drug, sometimes it's not interesting for many companies. So there's a problem. Is another outcome that I'm trying to investigate is the quality of the screening of sellers in this kind of thing. Maybe it's a worse kind of sellers in this situation. So this reflects a little bit the market conditions for that purchase. I don't understand your empirical strategy. Is DID, is the judicial decision is exogenous? Yeah. I have the same court, Tribunal Justiça de São Paulo. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm claiming that is this judicial decision is exogenous, and I'm trying to claim that the judicial decision itself, if we have the request, this request depend if it's successful or failure. It's almost always successful, right? High rates of that. But when they impact the executive, the reasons for the judicial request is does not affect the outcomes, the reasons. The outcomes of the tender's outcomes are affected by the conditions of the purchases themselves. So that's I'm trying to claim. Paulo Furquim, he was fixed effect for public. Exactly. Paulo Furquim, sorry. Paulo Furquim is my co-author in this paper. I didn't mention him, and he is here right now. The same lawyer too. The lawyer, I think we have this info in the court decisions, the texts, but I couldn't process the texts yet. So that's a good point. I could have as a next step of this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Darcy. So are there any questions, any other questions for Darcy? Otherwise, I'm gonna start my presentation now.
Sorry, another thing, comments are very, very welcome. It's a preliminary version of my paper. I didn't submit for any journal, of course. So if you want to contact me or to give some feedback about it, I'm gonna give you my email in the chat. I'm glad to receive all the comments, and thank you very much again for your contribution.
Okay, so I'm gonna present my paper now. Let me share my screen here. Just one second. Okay, so I'm Gustavo Simões. I'm a master's student here from FGV, and I'm gonna present you the paper that I've been working during my master's that is entitled Local Leaders and the Environment, Leader Resilience and Influence to Produce a Sustainable Environment. Just to anticipate some of our results, we identify here that local agribusiness leaders located in legal Amazon region promote economic development using economic incentives such as agricultural expenditure. We also identified that local agribusiness leaders do not make use of institutional incentives in order to promote reduction of deforestation. And we identified finally that top level leaders, the governors, do not influence how lower level leaders conduct their actions concerning economic development and deforestation levels. So I'm gonna present everything to you, how we got to these results. And firstly, I need to introduce to you the context where we are located. So the legal Amazon area corresponds to 40% of South America's area. It's present in 8 different countries and includes a lot of different issues here, because we have in one side 1.4 billion acres of forest, so leads to environmental issues. We have more than 25 million people living there, so we also have social issues involving indigenous inhabitants and a quite significant population. But we also have over 40% of Brazil's livestock production, what leads to commercial issues. And all of this has been presented in the academic side in 2 different manners. The first one, where researchers associate the growth of livestock and agricultural productions with the deforestation and the expansion of these limits, these production limits through legal reserves and the impact in protected areas. And on the other hand, we have other researchers, other academic works that associate the agricultural production development without the rise of deforestation. So in this academic research, they usually associate the new kind of agricultural production, more intensive and not too associated with deforestation rise. But all these works have been conducted focusing on the role of cattle ranchers and agricultural producers, also focusing on federal legislations such as the Forest Code, decrees, laws, but they do not take into account the influence and the impact of local leaders. So this is our main interest here, to understand how the local leaders could promote the reinforcement of federal and state legislations, for example, via ecological economic zoning and preliminary environmental impact analysis, and how they could use this to allocate this municipal resource in order to promote development and to control deforestation levels in legal Amazon. And our theory here is that we have a region which is quite complex because we have the association of resource institutions, several different stakeholders, some of them aiming for the maintenance of its livelihood, the conservation of forests, for example, the indigenous population, others aiming to expand their productions, but sometimes interested as well to do this with lower environmental impacts. And some of them, for instance, here, the small producers and workers, just looking for better living conditions and minimal impact on deforestation. And as you can see here, all this complexity, the conflicting interests that these stakeholders have lead to innumerable uncertainties. And this is the point where we know that local leadership, as stated here, plays a relevant role. Firstly, by promoting local initiatives that are more easily accepted by local followers, but also by shaping preferences and finding consensual alternatives to conflicts. That is just what we have in this region. And so, for instance, here, the leader elected must act as a strategist and to be resilient here. What means to promote economic development, but also to be concerned about environmental issues and to do some environment planning as well. And we use here as our leaders, as our local leaders, the mayors. They've been used in the same manner for a long time. And just because they exercise their leadership through formal and informal mechanisms in the region where they are acting. And all that I just said led us to our baseline hypothesis that leaders are resilient in an environment that demands sustainability. So this is our first investigation that we wanted to conduct. But in the sequence, we need to evaluate how they are resilient and what actions they take in order to be resilient. So we want to identify here the mechanisms that they use to promote economic development, analyzing extrinsic incentives. So we have previous works stating that investments on infrastructure and also on technical support, they are main drivers for sustainable development, which is again to develop the place economically, but also to be aware of deforestation levels. So this leads us to our second hypothesis, that is that local leaders use economic incentives in order to generate economic development. Following, we want to investigate another set of extrinsic incentives concerning conservation policies. Again, we have research that indicates that the use of conservation policies is associated with deforestation reduction. So we want to investigate here whether or not agribusiness leaders are doing something in this matter. As you can notice here, most part of policies usually come from national level, so we want to investigate if they are doing something locally. So our hypothesis 2B is that agribusiness leaders use institutional incentives in order to preserve the forest. And finally, our third hypothesis, we wanted to expand our investigation from local to state level. So we understand that to create public goods, it's required to have a collaboration between different level actors. So here we use the top leader as the state governor. We use the state governor as top leader and mayors as low leaders. And we want to investigate whether or not sustainable top leader influence low leaders on their demand. Just to give you some institutional background here, the legal Amazon area, as I cited previously, is an area corresponding to 60% of Brazil's territory, includes several different states. It was defined lastly by the federal law in 12,651 in 2012. And the first mention to this area was in the first forest code in 34, where the deforestation was allowed up to 75% of properties. And then we had the creation of superintendence of the Amazon Economic Valorization Plan in 53. Afterwards, the updated forest code in 65, reducing the legal area that could be deforested. And finally, in 2012, the creation of legal reserve debts and the possibility here to compensate the deforestation in different areas, which created a market. But this is the institutional background for the area. We also use here the municipal elections. So the background is that we have, the municipal legislations. The background is that in 97, the CONAMA just came and brought to the municipalities some responsibilities and also created the possibility of them to deal with environmental licensing and to analyze environmental impacts of activities, basically because the federal and state instance could not check everything that was happening in the municipalities. So the creation of municipal legislation concerning preliminary environmental impact analysis and also the economic zoning were brought to attention. But what we want to understand here is, did these municipalities create such legislations? If yes, the creation was favored by any sort of professional backgrounds of these leaders, because usually here the idea is that usually agribusiness leaders are pointed out as the villains of the region, people who are only concerned about developing economically and expanding their productions, but not worried about deforestation rates. This is the overall idea, that the public idea that is presented here. But we want to investigate further. And for this, we use the municipal elections to understand a bit more. So it was established in 1988's Constitution. And what is important for you here to understand our work is that we discarded the municipalities where there were over 200,000 voters due to the possibility of strategic voting, as long as in these municipalities they have 2 rounds elections. So here we discarded, but we still have over 750 municipalities to analyze. And coming to our data, we used the Superior Electoral Court data, basically the municipal elections for mayors from 96 to 2016, the characteristics of these candidates, and so on. We also used the Amazon Deforestation Monitoring Program data, which brings deforestation levels from 2000 to 2016. the accumulated deforestation by municipality. We use it as well, the annual reports of social information, basically to get some information concerning the businesses and the employment characteristics for each municipality. We use the municipal agricultural expenditure data from the Brazilian National Treasury. And finally, the characteristics of each municipality from the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. And our data here we use as a running variable. I will talk about the methodology afterwards, but we use it as running variable, the margin of victory. And we have several different dependent variables, the number of companies created, the number of companies created by categories, the herd size, planted area, accumulated deforestation, municipal incentives, and the existence of ecological economic zoning or preliminary environment impact analysis legislations, a dummy variable here. And as covariates, we use characteristics of the candidates, characteristics of the municipalities, and so on. And as you probably are aware now, we use it as a method, the sharp regression discontinuity design, following Arvati story, Eggers et al., Flemmer and Basil, because here in our context is one of the best alternatives to infer causality when the treatment, although not applied randomly, is applied following a specific cutoff, which is determined here. I will show you how. So it consists on a quasi-experimental design. And our steps here were, first of all, we defined the leaders with agribusiness backgrounds according to their professions prior to being candidates. And I will show you afterwards, but we tested several different occupations as well, and no other influence or dependent variables, only the agribusiness background did. And afterwards, we defined the running variable, which is the difference between the percentage of votes obtained by the first candidate, the candidate elected, and the runner-up. And we also chose the mean square error optimal bandwidth following canonical, so it was made automatically. And we use a fourth order polynomial as a local estimator, but we also conducted some robustness checks with lower order polynomials. And for internal validity, first of all, we checked for manipulation of the electoral process. And we did some histograms with different beans and conducted the Macquarie's test. And there was no manipulation of the electoral process found here. We also checked for any jumps in 23 covariates, including many characteristics that I showed to you. And we checked for dependent variables change due to movements prior to the term analyzed. So our results here for hypothesis 1, we found that the election of local farmers increased the creation of new business, but does not affect the deforestation levels. And as you can notice here, the business creation is influenced even for second degree polynomial as estimator. Specifically here, the creation of new business in the service and retail area. And as you can notice, for a 10% significance level, we observe some herd size increase, but we do not observe anything happening in deforestation. So as results for hypothesis 2A in this case, we noticed that agribusiness local leaders, they do have a greater expenditure in a greater agricultural expenditure than other leaders, but they do not use taxes or fees, incentives more than other professional backgrounds leaders. hypothesis 2B, we identified here that agribusiness leaders do not promote specific legislation, so they are doing nothing concerning to environmental legislations. And finally, here we had to change our methodology. We no longer used the RD method because we had a smaller number of observations, but we identified that the sustainable top leader did not influence the low-level leaders on their actions, leading to more economic development or reduce of deforestation. And finally, we brought some practical implications here because we identified that agribusiness leaders promote economic development, and we identified as well the mechanism by how they do this, using direct investments on the agricultural sector. We found no evidence that agribusiness backgrounds influenced the creation of environmental legislation, here dealing with deforestation. And as theoretical contributions, we identified the influence of leaders' backgrounds on the economic development of their influence regions, which is interesting because so far the research were conducted in a more broad level. Now we are bringing attention to the leaders themselves. And we also found that the role of local leadership on practical matters concerning local sustainable development could be more important here, because these local leaders could be developing these legislations, for instance. Okay, so thank you very much. I will check the doubts now in the chat, and in case you have any commentary or any suggestions, will be very welcome. Let me just check the chat here. Okay, so is it possible to classify local leaders as environment friendly or otherwise by means of regular expressions on their speech or government program? Probably their policy would be different. So Professor Paulo, what we did here, first of all, was to segment the professionals, the professional backgrounds of these candidates. So the idea was that, for instance, for example, a biology professor that was elected probably would have some actions that the cattle rancher elected would not. And the idea was to understand if we understand that the professional background would be more relevant here than the fact that they said something to get our votes or something like this. I don't know if I made my point clear, but we checked for counselors, we checked for doctors, we checked for professors. We have, if I recall, almost 11, 12 different professions that we tested here. Some agribusiness activities, soybean and certified forestry, may be more concerned with deforestation and others with deforestation and others more concerned. Maybe distinguishing agribusiness leader would lead to heterogeneous effects. And we tried to, yeah, this is an interesting point. The fact here, Professor, I think that the livestock, or we identified the second part of research that I showed to you, is leading the same way that you presented here, because they point that nowadays you cannot use, you cannot sell your product if you are not environmental friendly, and this can lead to some barriers for exportation and so on. So our point here is that these producers are no longer just aiming for expand their productions, and they would be willing to attend to some specific legislations in order to promote their sales, not because they are quite interested in the decrease of deforestation levels only. But I would take your suggestion here and check if we can isolate this. But the difficulty here is that we use the TSE database, and they just brought to us the profession as agribusiness in general, and it's not too specific. But it's interesting the point that you brought here. Let me check if are there any other questions. Yeah, I think these were the two questions that I had here. Does anyone have any other question or wanted to discuss or give me some advice here? I'm quite open to receive this feedback. That's it. So I think that we are done here for this set of presentations, and if anyone has anything to say.
Só para finalizar aí, eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aí e lembrar que a gente tem uma outra sessão de business na quinta-feira, das 13 às 14h30, tá certo? Se vocês puderem participar, tá com o nome de microeconomia, mas não é microeconomia, é uma reunião de business. Vão ser apresentados outros 3 trabalhos aí, então eu gostaria de contar com a participação de vocês lá para fazer comentários, sugestões. Sempre é bem legal assim a gente se reunir e tal. Saber que a gente teve assim de 15 a 25 pessoas participando aí da sala, isso é muito legal porque dá a entender que a gente não está fazendo esse esforço sozinho, né, de tentar reunir o pessoal, de discutir coisas que possam ajudar as pessoas tecnicamente nos seus trabalhos, tal. Então eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos aí. Nos vemos então.
Queria agradecer.
Aí. Opa!
Queria agradecer também a oportunidade aqui de, como eu falei, né, a segunda vez que eu apresento, tá, o paper tem um caminho, agradeço os comentários e, de novo, fico à disposição aí. Obrigado, viu?
Vou te mandar um paper que eu tenho com... É um experimento com o Sérgio Mittilander, que é um cara que está em Munique, que a gente fez tentando separar essa coisa da corrupção e waste, né? Como é que o eleitor percebe isso? E o grande problema do waste não ser considerado pelo eleitor como uma punição para os candidatos é que assim ele não é informado. Se você informar ele acaba punindo o cara da mesma forma que ele punia corrupção. Então, é um problema de informação. Aí você pode, sei lá, só para dar uma olhada aí no que você está fazendo, talvez ajude, mas está muito legal.
Excelente. Obrigado, viu?
Gostei das apresentações aí, foram muito legais. Espero que a gente continue nessa batalha aí de sempre melhorar as coisas e sempre para frente. Ok? Nos vemos então lá na quinta-feira às 13h, o pessoal de business de novo.
Valeu.
As outras reuniões por aí. Aproveitem, que é bem variado as coisas, tem muita coisa tecnicamente boa de se ver e tal. Tá certo? Sempre ajuda a olhar o trabalho dos outros, como é que o cara está resolvendo problemas, isso ajuda bastante. Certo? Abraço a todos aí.
Obrigado,
Valeu.
pessoal. Valeu.
Falou, Paulão. Um grande abraço para você aí, meu.